In the flickering candlelight of his modest room, Friedrich Nietzsche penned words that would forever change our understanding of human nature. In solitude, the lonely man feeds upon himself. In the crowd, the many feed upon him. Now choose this wasn't merely philosophical rhetoric, it was the crystallization of a profound truth that has echoed through the corridors of human history, a truth that reveals why the greatest minds of our species have often walked the loneliest paths. Today, we embark on a journey into the shadowy realm where brilliance meets isolation, where the pursuit of wisdom exacts a price that few are willing to pay. This is not a story of martyrdom or self-pity, but rather an exploration of a fundamental paradox of human existence, that those who see furthest into the nature of reality often find themselves most distant from their fellow humans. The question that haunts us is not whether solitude breeds wisdom, but whether wisdom inevitably breeds solitude. As we peel back the layers of this ancient mystery, we'll discover that the relationship between intellectual depth and social isolation is not coincidental, it's architectural, built into the very foundations of how human consciousness operates and how society functions. The architecture of intellectual isolation. To understand why profound thinkers so often find themselves alone, we must first examine the psychological mechanisms that govern human social behavior. The human mind, despite its remarkable capacity for reason, remains fundamentally tribal. We are creatures evolved for survival in small, cohesive groups where conformity was often the difference between life and death. This evolutionary heritage creates what psychologists call the conformity bias, our innate tendency to align our thoughts and behaviors with those around us. But what happens when an individual's cognitive development transcends these tribal boundaries? When someone begins to see patterns that others cannot perceive, to question assumptions that others accept without thought, to pursue truths that challenge the comfortable illusions upon which society rests, the result is almost inevitable: a growing chasm between the individual and the collective. Nietzsche understood this dynamic with piercing clarity. In Beyond Good and Evil, he wrote, "The higher men live at a discount. They are more vulnerable. They waste themselves. They are more often destroyed." This wasn't pessimism, it was recognition of a fundamental truth about the relationship between intellectual advancement and social integration. The process begins subtly. A young mind, perhaps more curious than its peers, starts asking questions that adults find uncomfortable. Why do we believe what we believe? What if our most cherished assumptions are wrong? These questions, innocent in their inception, mark the beginning of a journey that will increasingly separate the questioner from the questioned. Consider the psychological dynamics at play when someone consistently challenges prevailing wisdom. The group, feeling threatened by implications that their beliefs might be unfounded, responds with what social psychologists call defensive attribution. The challenger is not simply wrong, they are dangerous, antisocial, a threat to the stability that keeps the community functioning. This response is not conscious malice but an automatic defense mechanism evolved over millennia. Historical witnesses to intellectual exile. The pages of history are filled with individuals whose profound insights earned them not celebration but persecution, not communion but exile. Their stories illuminate the recurring pattern of how society treats those who dare to think beyond its boundaries. Galileo Galilei stands as perhaps the most iconic example of this phenomenon. When he pointed his telescope toward the heavens and discovered moons orbiting Jupiter, he didn't merely find celestial bodies, he found evidence that shattered the entire cosmological framework of his time. The Earth was not the center of all creation. Humans were not positioned at the cosmic throne of importance. This discovery should have been cause for celebration, a triumph of human ingenuity and understanding. Instead, it earned Galileo condemnation, house arrest, and the bitter loneliness of a man whose vision of reality was too advanced for his contemporaries to accept. The psychological toll of such isolation cannot be overstated. Galileo's letters from his final years reveal a man who had sacrificed not just career and comfort but the fundamental human need for intellectual companionship. He had seen truths that he could share with no one, understood realities that isolated him from every conversation about the nature of existence. This was not the romantic solitude of the poet but the existential loneliness of the prophet cursed, to see what others cannot yet perceive. Similarly, Charles Darwin spent decades in intellectual isolation before publishing On the Origin of Species. He understood the implications of his discoveries long before he dared share them with the world. The theory of evolution by natural selection didn't just challenge religious doctrine, it fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of its place in the natural order. Darwin's correspondence reveals a man tormented, not just by the controversy his ideas would generate but by the profound loneliness of harboring truths too revolutionary for his society to accept. The psychological burden of this isolation manifested in Darwin's chronic health problems, which many historians now believe were largely psychosomatic, the physical expression of the mental strain of intellectual exile. He wrote to a friend, "I am almost convinced that species are not immutable, but then I feel like confessing to a murder." This wasn't hyperbole, but genuine anguish at the social death that comes with intellectual heresy. Nikola Tesla presents perhaps the most poignant example of genius isolated by its own brilliance. Tesla's mind operated on frequencies that his contemporaries could not tune into. His visions of wireless communication, alternating current, and technologies that wouldn't be realized for decades made him appear not just eccentric but almost otherworldly to his peers. Edison, his contemporary and rival, operated within conventional frameworks of understanding. Tesla's mind ranged far beyond such limitations, seeing possibilities that wouldn't become realities until long after his death. The psychological profile that emerges from Tesla's life is that of a man whose intellectual gifts became a prison. His ability to visualize complex inventions in perfect detail, to see the future of technology with startling clarity, left him unable to find meaningful intellectual companionship among his contemporaries. His famous obsessions and quirks were not mere eccentricities but coping mechanisms for a mind that had outgrown its social environment. Tesla's notebooks reveal the depth of his isolation, detailed plans for inventions that wouldn't be possible for decades, theories about energy and matter that wouldn't be understood until the development of quantum mechanics, visions of a connected world that seemed like pure fantasy to minds trapped in the mechanical thinking of the 19th century. He died alone in a hotel room, surrounded by the physical detritus of a brilliant mind that had been too far ahead of its time to find its tribe. Vincent van Gogh's story adds another dimension to our understanding of intellectual and creative isolation. Van Gogh's artistic vision was so far removed from the aesthetic sensibilities of his time that he sold only one painting during his lifetime. But his isolation went deeper than mere commercial failure. It was the isolation of it, the consciousness that perceived reality through a lens so fundamentally different from his contemporaries that meaningful communication became nearly impossible. Van Gogh's letters to his brother, Theo, provide a window into the psychological landscape of creative genius trapped in social exile. He wrote, "I want to touch people with my art. I want them to say, he feels deeply, he feels tenderly, yet the very depth and tenderness of his perception created works so intense, so emotionally raw, that they frightened rather than comforted his potential audience." The tragedy of Van Gogh's life wasn't just his mental illness, it was the way his extraordinary sensitivity to beauty and suffering made him fundamentally incompatible with the social world of his time. His paintings captured aspects of reality that others couldn't see: the emotional resonance of color, the spiritual dimension of natural forms, the psychological depth hidden in simple scenes. This gift, which would eventually make him one of history's most celebrated artists, condemned him to a lifetime of incomprehension and rejection. Edgar Allan Poe embodied the intersection of intellectual brilliance and psychological isolation. His mind delved into territories of human experience that his contemporaries preferred to leave unexplored: the darker recesses of consciousness, the thin boundaries between sanity and madness, the psychological mechanisms underlying fear and obsession. Poe didn't just write about psychological horror. He mapped the geography of the human psyche with a precision that wouldn't be matched until the development of modern psychology decades later. Poe's intellectual isolation was compounded by his understanding that his insights into human nature revealed truths that society was not prepared to confront. His stories and essays demonstrated a psychological sophistication that placed him generations ahead of his time. But this same sophistication made him appear morbid and disturbing to readers who preferred literature that confirmed their comfortable assumptions about human nature. The psychological toll of this isolation permeates Poe's work. His protagonists are typically isolated individuals, scholars, artists, philosophers who have pursued knowledge or beauty to the point where it separates them from normal human experience. These weren't just fictional creations but psychological self-portraits of a mind that had ventured too far into unexplored territories of thought to find its way back to conventional social connection. The Nietzschean perspective, beyond good and evil in solitude. Nietzsche himself serves as perhaps the most profound example of the very phenomenon he diagnosed. His philosophical journey took him far beyond the moral and intellectual frameworks of his time, into territories of thought so radical that they would not be fully understood for generations. His concept of the Bermensch wasn't a call for superhuman beings but a recognition that human consciousness could evolve beyond its current limitations, a process that necessarily involves transcending the social and moral constraints that bind ordinary thinking. The psychological dynamics of Nietzsche's intellectual development reveal the inevitable progression from conformity to isolation that marks the path of radical thinking. His early works showed promise within conventional philosophical frameworks, earning him academic recognition and social acceptance. But as his thinking deepened and became more original, he found himself increasingly estranged from the intellectual community that had initially welcomed him. Nietzsche's famous declaration that God is dead wasn't atheistic shock value, but a profound recognition that the moral and metaphysical foundations of Western civilization had become untenable. This insight, which would prove prophetic of the 20th century's spiritual and moral crises, placed him in a position of terrible isolation. He had diagnosed the death of the very belief system that held his society together, leaving him intellectually and emotionally stranded in a post-religious landscape that his contemporaries were not yet ready to inhabit. The psychological pressure of this position is evident in Nietzsche's increasingly intense and desperate attempts to communicate his insights. His later works, particularly Thus Spoke Zarathustra, employ increasingly poetic and metaphorical language not as stylistic choice but as a necessary adaptation to the impossibility of direct communication. When one's insights transcend the conceptual frameworks available to one's audience, direct statement becomes impossible. One must resort to symbol, metaphor, and myth tools of the prophet speaking to those not yet ready to understand. Nietzsche's final mental collapse can be understood not just as the result of illness but as the inevitable outcome of a mind that had pushed beyond the boundaries of what human consciousness could bear in isolation. His notebooks from his final productive years reveal a man desperately seeking intellectual companionship, while simultaneously recognizing that his level of insight had made such companionship impossible. He wrote to friends about his loneliness, his sense of being misunderstood, his desperate hope that future generations might understand what his contemporaries could not. The psychology of intellectual threat. To understand why brilliant minds so often find themselves socially isolated, we must examine the psychological mechanisms that make intelligence appear threatening to ordinary social consciousness. The human psyche has evolved elaborate defense mechanisms to protect the ego from information that challenges its fundamental assumptions about reality. When confronted with ideas that threaten our basic beliefs about ourselves and our world, we don't simply evaluate these ideas rationally. We experience them as attacks on our very identity. This defensive response operates below the threshold of consciousness. When an individual consistently presents ideas that challenge group assumptions, the group doesn't consciously decide to reject that person it experiences. An automatic threat response that manifests as discomfort, suspicion, and eventual exclusion. The person presenting challenging ideas becomes associated not with truth or insight, but with the psychological pain of having one's worldview questioned. Consider the social dynamics that emerge when someone in a group consistently demonstrates superior insight or understanding. The initial response might be admiration or respect, but this quickly transforms into something more complex and troubling. The person's very presence becomes a reminder to others of their own intellectual limitations, triggering what psychologists call defensive devaluation, the unconscious tendency to diminish the importance or validity of something that makes us feel inadequate. This process is particularly pronounced when the superior understanding involves fundamental questions about the nature of reality, morality, or human existence. When someone demonstrates the ability to think beyond conventional frameworks, they implicitly challenge not just specific beliefs but the entire cognitive approach that others use to navigate existence. The psychological threat this represents cannot be overestimated. It strikes at the very core of how individuals construct their sense of reality and identity. The evolutionary perspective on this phenomenon reveals its deep roots in human nature. In ancestral environments, individuals who deviated too far from group norms posed potential threats to group cohesion and survival. The tendency to ostracize or eliminate such individuals was adaptive. It preserved the social bonds that enabled group survival. These same psychological mechanisms operate today, even though the contexts have changed dramatically. The result is a tragic irony. Those individuals whose insights could most benefit humanity often find themselves least able to communicate those insights effectively. Their very brilliance becomes a barrier to connection, their greatest gifts the source of their deepest isolation. This dynamic helps explain why so many revolutionary ideas in science, philosophy, and art have been initially rejected, only to be accepted years or decades later when the broader population has evolved enough to understand them. Modern manifestations of ancient patterns. The digital age has created new dimensions of intellectual isolation, even as it has provided new opportunities for connection. The phenomenon of the extremely online intellectual, the person whose digital presence demonstrates profound insight but whose real-world social connections remain limited, represents a contemporary manifestation of ancient patterns. Social media algorithms, designed to maximize engagement, often reward conformity and punish the kind of challenging insights that have always marked original thinking. The psychological dynamics that isolated historical geniuses operate with equal force in contemporary contexts. Online communities can provide intellectual stimulation and connection, but they can also create echo chambers that amplify the isolation of truly original thinkers. When someone's insights transcend the conceptual frameworks available even within specialized online communities, they can find themselves as isolated as any historical genius. Despite having access to global communication networks, contemporary neuroscience has revealed the biological basis for the social dynamics that create intellectual isolation. Mirror neurons, which enable empathy and social connection, function most effectively when individuals share similar cognitive patterns and experiences. When someone's thinking patterns deviate significantly from the norm, these neurological mechanisms for social connection become less effective. creating a biological basis for the social isolation that accompanies intellectual advancement. The implications of this research are profound. It suggests that the loneliness experienced by original thinkers isn't just a social phenomenon but has deep biological roots. The very neural mechanisms that enable human social connection are calibrated to work best within relatively narrow ranges of cognitive similarity. When individual development transcends these ranges, the biological foundation for social belonging begins to erode. The transformative power of solitude, yet solitude, while painful, serves a crucial function in the development of original thought. The absence of social validation forces the mind to develop internal criteria for truth and value. Without the constant feedback of social approval or disapproval, thinking becomes more independent, more willing to pursue unpopular conclusions, more capable of sustained focus on complex problems that don't yield to conventional approaches. Kierkegaard, himself a profound example of the genius in isolation, wrote extensively about the necessity of solitude for authentic existence. His concept of the knight of faith describes someone who has moved beyond conventional morality and social validation to develop a direct personal relationship with truth and meaning. This journey necessarily involves a period of isolation, what Kierkegaard called the anguish of Abraham, during which the individual must learn to find certainty within themselves rather than in the approval of others. The psychological transformation that occurs during extended solitude is profound and often permanent. The mind learns to function without external validation, developing what we might call cognitive autonomy, the ability to pursue truth independent of social consequences. This autonomy is essential for original thought, but it comes at the cost of easy social integration. Once someone has learned to think independently, they often find it difficult or impossible to return to the comfortable conformity that characterizes normal social existence. Sartre's exploration of existential isolation provides another lens through which to understand this phenomenon. His famous assertion that hell is other people wasn't misanthropy but recognition that authentic existence requires accepting the fundamental isolation of consciousness. Each individual must construct their own meaning and values, a process that cannot be done collectively. The attempt to find meaning through conformity to group values results in what Sartre called bad faith, self-deception that avoids the responsibility and loneliness of authentic existence. The existentialist insight into the necessity of solitude for authentic development has been confirmed by contemporary research in psychology and neuroscience. Periods of solitude appear to be crucial for the kind of deep reflection and integration that enables original thinking. The brain's default mode network, which is most active during periods of rest and introspection, seems to be where the most creative and original insights emerge. This network cannot function effectively when consciousness is constantly engaged with social stimulation and feedback. The price and promise of intellectual independence. The stories of history's most original thinkers reveal both the terrible price and the transformative promise of intellectual independence. Alan Turing, whose mathematical genius laid the foundation for modern computing and artificial intelligence, found himself isolated not only by his intellectual gifts but by his sexual orientation in a society that criminalized homosexuality. His ability to see patterns and possibilities that others we couldn't perceive extended beyond mathematics into the realm of human consciousness itself. He was among the first to seriously consider the possibility of artificial intelligence and to develop frameworks for understanding machine thinking. Turing's isolation was compounded by the classified nature of much of his work during World War II. His contributions to breaking the Enigma code saved countless lives and shortened the war, but this achievement had to remain secret for decades, leaving him unable to receive recognition for what may have been his greatest contribution to human welfare. The psychological toll of this enforced secrecy, combined with social ostracism for his personal life and intellectual isolation due to his extraordinary abilities, ultimately proved unbearable. Marie Curie faced the compound isolation that comes with being both intellectually exceptional and socially marginalized. Her scientific achievements were remarkable enough to earn her 2 Nobel Prizes in different fields, a feat that remains unique in the history of science. But her position as a woman in the male-dominated world of early 20th century science created additional layers of isolation. She was brilliant enough to see beyond the conceptual limitations of her contemporaries, but social prejudice prevented her from being fully accepted even within the scientific community that benefited from her discoveries. Curie's personal letters reveal the psychological complexity of her position. She found deep satisfaction in her scientific work, but profound loneliness in her inability to share her intellectual life fully with others. Even her husband Pierre, himself a distinguished scientist, could not entirely bridge the gap between her level of insight and the intellectual world available to her contemporaries. After his death, her isolation became even more pronounced. A brilliant mind trapped in a social environment that could neither fully understand nor fully accept her contributions. The pattern repeats across disciplines and centuries. Original thinking exacts a price in social connection, but it also opens doorways to understanding that would otherwise remain closed. Wittgenstein, whose philosophical investigations revolutionized our understanding of language and meaning, who lived much of his later life in voluntary isolation, working as a gardener and hospital porter after abandoning his academic career. His insights into the nature of language and thought were so radical that even other philosophers struggled to understand their implications. Wittgenstein's notebooks reveal a mind constantly pushing against the boundaries of what language and thought could accomplish. His famous declaration that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, wasn't philosophical posturing but recognition of the fundamental limitations that constrain human understanding. Having pushed philosophical inquiry to its limits, he found himself in a position where further communication became nearly impossible, not because he lacked ability, but because he had seen beyond the conceptual frameworks that enable ordinary discourse. The evolutionary paradox of genius from an evolutionary perspective. The phenomenon of intellectual isolation presents a fascinating paradox. If original thinking and superior intelligence provided clear survival advantages, we might expect such traits to become more common over time. Instead, we observe the opposite. Truly original thinkers remain rare, and when they do appear, they often struggle to reproduce successfully both genetically and intellectually. This paradox suggests that individual intellectual advancement beyond certain thresholds may actually conflict with the evolutionary advantage that comes from effective social integration. In ancestral environments, the ability to function effectively within group structures was often more important for survival and reproduction than superior individual intelligence. This creates what evolutionary psychologists call a cognitive trade-off. Advancement in individual thinking ability may come at the cost of social integration skills that are crucial for evolutionary success. The implications extend beyond individual psychology to questions about the long-term development of human consciousness. If the most advanced thinkers consistently find themselves isolated and less likely to pass on their traits, whether genetic or cultural, then human intellectual evolution may be the very advances in thinking that could benefit the species as a whole may be constrained by social dynamics that evolved for different purposes. Contemporary research in behavioral genetics suggests that traits associated with high intelligence and original thinking, including tendencies toward nonconformity, intense focus, and independent thinking, are indeed associated with reduced social integration and lower reproductive success in many contexts. This creates a tragic irony. The individuals whose insights could most advance human understanding are systematically selected against by the very evolutionary processes that created human intelligence in the first place. Reconciling solitude and society. Yet perhaps the story need not end in tragedy. Understanding the dynamics that create intellectual isolation might enable us to develop new approaches to integrating original thinkers into social structures. The digital age, despite its challenges, has created unprecedented opportunities for brilliant but socially isolated individuals to find intellectual companionship across geographic and cultural boundaries. Online communities focused on specific intellectual interests can provide the kind of deep, sustained engagement that brilliant minds need to flourish. These communities can offer validation and feedback that enables continued growth while reducing the psychological burden of complete isolation. The key is creating environments where intellectual depth is valued over social conformity, where challenging ideas are welcomed rather than feared. Educational institutions have a particular responsibility to recognize and nurture original thinking while helping brilliant students develop the social skills they need to communicate their insights effectively. This requires moving beyond standardized approaches to education toward more individualized methods that can accommodate minds that think in fundamentally different ways. The corporate world, too, is beginning to recognize the value of intellectual diversity and the need to create environments where original thinkers can contribute effectively. Companies that successfully harness the insights of brilliant but socially atypical individuals often outperform their competitors precisely because they can access perspectives and solutions that more conventional organizations miss. Perhaps most importantly, society as a whole must grapple with the implications of intellectual diversity. Just as we have begun to recognize and accommodate other forms of human diversity, we may need to develop new frameworks for understanding and integrating cognitive diversity. This means creating social structures that can benefit from original thinking without requiring original thinkers to sacrifice their intellectual authenticity for social acceptance. The continuing journey, the tension between solitude and wisdom, between intellectual advancement and social connection, remains one of the fundamental challenges of human existence. As we advance technologically and scientifically, we may be creating conditions that make this tension even more pronounced. Artificial intelligence and genetic engineering may soon enable forms of intellectual enhancement that could create new categories of cognitive isolation. Yet the examples of history's greatest thinkers also provide hope. Despite their isolation, their insights eventually found audiences. Their ideas eventually took root. Their contributions eventually became part of the common heritage of human understanding. The fact that we can now discuss these patterns, recognize these dynamics, and perhaps develop strategies for addressing them suggests that human consciousness continues to evolve in ways that might eventually transcend the limitations that have historically constrained it. The journey into wisdom may indeed require solitude, but solitude need not be permanent exile. The challenge is to find ways to honor both the requirements of original thinking and the human need for connection and community. This may require new forms of social organization, new approaches to education, new technologies for communication, and new frameworks for understanding human diversity. As we stand at the threshold of unprecedented technological and scientific advancement, the lessons learned from history's brilliant outcasts become more relevant than ever. Their struggles with isolation illuminate not just personal tragedies but species-wide challenges that we must address if we hope to continue advancing in wisdom and understanding. The path forward may require courage, the courage to think beyond conventional boundaries, to challenge comfortable assumptions, to pursue truth even when it leads to uncomfortable conclusions. But it also requires compassion for those whose gifts isolate them, understanding of the psychological costs of original thinking, and commitment to creating communities that can embrace both conformity and transcendence. In the end, Nietzsche's insight remains as relevant today as it was in his own time of isolation. The choice between solitude and the crowd is not just a personal decision, but a fundamental orientation toward existence itself. Those who choose the path of wisdom must be prepared for the loneliness it entails, but they must also hold hope that their journey, however isolated, contributes to the eventual expansion of human consciousness and understanding. The secret to unlocking true wisdom may indeed lie in embracing solitude, but the ultimate goal must be to transform that solitude from exile into pilgrimage, a journey not away from humanity but toward a more complete understanding of what humanity might become. Have you ever felt that the deeper you think, the more isolated you become? Leave a comment below sharing whether you've experienced this or know someone who has lived through this experience. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more reflections on the most brilliant minds in history.